In determining which children are one's own, there is inequality of need for trust, since no mother need depend on another person to determine which child is her child. From this trivial and anatomical observation is derived that vast difference betwixt the education and the duties of the two sexes. By Hume's account, the male needs to know which children are his children more than does the female, since he is expected not merely to give a loose to love and tenderness, but also to undergo cheerfully all the fatigues and expenses of child care. He also wants to ensure that his property is not passed on to a wrong object, by Hume's earlier account of the natural right of succession. The female parent must trust the male to share the fatigue of child care, but by Hume's account it is the males who are most vulnerable to breach of trust, who are forced into trust. By that lack of security concerning which objects are their own, due to the fact that since in the copulation of the sexes the principle of generation goes from the man to the woman, an error may easily take place on the side of the former, though it be utterly impossible with regard to the latter. Hume's account of the demand for female chastity depends upon his psychological premises that men will be unwilling to care for children not believed to be biologically their own, as well on his epistemological and anatomical premises concerning the natural uncertainty of paternity. It also depends upon an assumption made but not stated, namely that a society be both patriarchal, so that control of expenses is in male hands, and patrilineal, so that property passes through the male line. In a matriarchal and matrilineal society, the question of true paternity would become as trivial as the anatomical facts which make error there so easy. Another suppressed premise in Hume's account is that a double standard operate not only between the sexes, but within the female sex as well. Although Hume says that special restrictions are imposed over the whole sex, his account requires that there be some women available as partners for those debauched bachelors and straying husbands who are granted a greater liberty of indulging their appetite in venereal enjoyment. As Hume knew very well, neither the servant woman in Ninewells nor the royal mistresses of Paris aspired to be mothers of children of recognized lineage and title to property, so could afford to risk bad fame by their lewdness and impudence. His contemporary, Bernard Mandeville, is very clear on this point. If courtesans and strumpets were to be prosecuted with as much vigor as some silly people would have it, what locks and bars would be sufficient to preserve the honor of our wives and daughters? It is manifest that there is a necessity of sacrificing one part of womankind to preserve the other, and prevent a filthiness of a more heinous nature. Hume knows and by implication recognizes these simple truths, but his emphasis is in the chapter of Chastity and Modesty, is on the role of the artificial virtue of chastity in persuading males to share responsibility of child-rearing and the preparation of all women for their child-bearing role. He sees clearly that the heart of the problem concerns the role of childbearing, the responsibility for child-rearing, the unalterable division of the labor for the former, the socially contrived division of responsibility for the latter, and the complicating thread of trust tying the sexual parties together in different sorts of dependency. Hume's chapter is sometimes perceived, and was earlier perceived by me, as sexist in tone and content, but now I find it remarkable for its devastating clarity, its exposure of the double standard as a useful means of indulging the vanity of socially powerful males, and as a response to their reluctance to share the costs of childbearing, their stinginess or confined generosity, in assumption of responsibility for new members of society. Hume does not minimize the costs of the artifice to women. Unlike Mandeville, he does not see the drive for sexual pleasure as originating only in the males. The principle of generation may go from the man to the woman, but the pleasure principle is seen as operating as more strongly in females than in males. All human creatures, especially of the female sex, are apt to overlook remote motives in favor of any present temptation. The temptation is here the strongest imaginable. Some readers of Hume may find these words evidence for, rather than against, his sexism. But it ought to be noted that Hume's ideal for human beings is not a preference for remote interest over contiguous agreeable pleasure, but an alignment of the two. Hedonistic indulgence is no worse a fault on his account than cold calculation of interest, neglect of the agreeable for the useful. Throughout the treatise in Book 2, in the section on the amorous passion, in Book 3, in his account of sexual union as the original principle of human society, of the natural family as the forerunner of artifice-secured societies, in the nice reverse sexism of his account of the natural virtue of being what we call good women's men, as well as in the section on chastity and modesty, Hume shows himself in his writings, as he did in his life, remarkably free of discriminatory sexism. Even his failure to note that socially contrived condition of patrilineal succession as a needed background for the virtue of female chastity is only a local failure. Elsewhere, he shows considerable awareness of and interest in that convention, an awareness helped by his high esteem for his mother, and by the fact that her sex prevented her from inheriting the Falconer family title. Hume considers the demand for female chastity so unnatural, the difficulty of combating natural desire so great, that the artifice of chastity needs the supplementation of the sister virtue of modesty. Fear of bad fame for lapses from chastity is insufficient as a motive. A woman may still flatter herself she shall find certain means of securing her reputation and preventing all the pernicious consequences of her pleasure. 'Tis necessary, therefore, that besides the infamy attending such licenses, there should be some preceding backwardness or dread. Modesty prepares the way for chastity, and Hume presents it as a socially approved deformation, like Chinese foot binding. Here Mandeville is more explicit than Hume. Miss is scarce 3 years old, but she is spoke to every day to hide her leg, and rebuked in good earnest. Hume emphasizes the exaggeration of the demand for modesty in relation to its rationale. Men have undoubtedly an implicit notion that all those ideas of modesty and chastity have a regard to generation, yet the general rule carries us beyond the original principle and makes us extend the notion of modesty over the whole sex, from their earliest infancy to their extremest old age and infirmity. Hume regards it as so obvious that female chastity and exterior modesty have no foundation in nature that he says any doubts his reader may have concerning his general thesis that some virtues depend upon useful artifices will be removed by a consideration of modesty and chastity. These, he says, are still more conspicuous instances of the operation of those principles which I have insisted on. Here Hume is in error. Conspicuous instances of artificial contrivance, though they may be, they are also counter-instances to 3 important ingredients in the principles Hume insisted on in his treatment of the main artificial virtues: honesty, fidelity to promises, and loyalty. Firstly, they were claimed to be dependent on obvious and absolutely necessary artifices, and so to be as natural as anything which proceeds immediately from original principles, without the intervention of thought or reflection. No such claim is made for chastity and modesty, which are presented as useful but dependent upon highly unnatural, not natural, social contrivances. Chastity is vaguely related by Hume to fidelity to the marriage bed, and so too to fidelity to promises, but it is not reducible to a special case of that, since the obligation of chastity is supposed to lie on all women, regardless of the particular content of promises they have made. This inflexible, unvarying requirement leaves no room for choice, only with respect to which male shall be the only sexual partner, and so contrasts with the adaptability of promise, which is warped into as many different forms as that social interest requires. Voluntary binding of oneself by a promise is a natural artifice. But the non-voluntary other imposed obligations of modesty and chastity are portrayed by Hume as contrary to nature, as the forced backwardness to the approaches of a pleasure, to which nature has inspired so strong a propensity, and a propensity that 'tis absolutely necessary in the end to comply with, for the support of the species. There may be a sense of common interest lying behind recognition of this virtue, but it is not a sense of equal interest. The second difference between chastity and other artificial virtues is that they involve a motive, avidity which corrects itself by artifices, since there is no passion capable of controlling the interested affection, but the very affection itself by an alteration of its direction. By contrast, the sexual appetite is not a self-correcting passion, but is corrected, on Hume's account, by independent motives. Concern that one's children receive paternal recognition and inheritance. Concern for the support of the species is not what corrects sexual desire. What corrects it is male vanity and lack of generosity, female concern for reputation, and the concern of both sexes for the recognition and privilege of those individual members of the species who are biologically their own. The whole reproductive process in the species may correct itself, but in individuals, sexual appetite and parental concern are separate passions. Thirdly, the artificial virtues of chastity and modesty are unlike the others in Hume's treatment of them, in the emphasis given to the importance of the individual constancy of behavior, as distinct from constancy in a population. Up until this point in Part 2 of Book 3, Hume has emphasized the need for general consistency of behavior within a population if artificial virtues are to merit recognition, and so, since their existence, unlike that of the natural virtues, depends upon recognition, if they are to exist at all. Related to this demand for general consistency, but not very clearly or persuasively related, is his emphasis on individual reputation for intra-life consistency or virtue, and on the risk of losing it by a single theft, breach of contract, or treacherous act. When he turns to chastity, the spotlight is on individual spotless, lifelong reputation, not on consistency within a population. Indeed, as I have shown for Hume's account of the rationale for a special demand for chastity imposed on women, but not men to work at all, he assumes that a convenient number of the female population will be immodest and unchaste. The modesty and chastity of mothers, of sons, of wealthy males may be useful to those males, but are conspicuous counter-instances to the claim that I should be the cully of my integrity if I alone should impose upon myself a severe restraint amidst the licentiousness of others. The licentiousness of other women will not only not diminish the point of the virtuous wife's fidelity to the marriage bed, if that point is assurance for the husband of his paternity of his children, but will be depended upon to relieve her from the importunities of those debauched bachelors and straying husbands who make up the male population by Hume's account. It is not consistency in a population which is emphasized in the rationale Hume gives of chastity, but consistency within an individual life. If the point of the virtue is assurance of true paternity, then fidelity to the marriage bed can be as decisively destroyed by one lapse as can virginity. Hume shows some uneasiness over the correct classification of these virtues by his inclusion of fidelity in a list of natural virtues. This cannot be fidelity to promises, which is definitely an artificial virtue, nor surely is it chastity. Some more primitive and non-discriminatory virtue, fidelity to an informal understanding between lovers which unites them and preserves their union, may be the natural virtue which has one formal feature Hume requires of chastity. namely, that one lapse destroys it by destroying trust.